Good Times put the first black two-parent family on American television, and then the cast lived out a story harder than any episode. 4 of these 8 people are gone. 1 was fired and written into a fatal car crash. Here is where every one of them ended up. The first face belongs to the man who carried that apartment on his back. John Amos played James Evans Sr., the father working 2 and sometimes 3 jobs to keep 5 people fed in a Chicago high-rise, and he gave that man a quiet thunder that made every soft moment land twice as hard. Before any of this, Amos had lived several lives. He played college football at Colorado State, suited up briefly as a professional, worked as a social worker in New York City, and wrote advertising copy in Los Angeles before he ever stood in front of an audience telling jokes in Greenwich Village. What happened to him on Good Times became the wound the whole series carried. The cast was almost entirely black while the writers were almost entirely white, and Amos believed those writers were building a black father out of guesswork rather than truth. He fought them. His resistance grew loudest as the show poured more and more of itself into his television son, JJ, and the broad comedy that came with him. Producers eventually told Amos his services were no longer wanted because he had become, in their words, a disruptive element. After 3 seasons, they fired him, and the 4th season opened by killing James Evans in a car accident, a death the audience never saw coming and never quite forgave. Then came the part nobody scripted. Days after being told he might never work again, Amos was cast as the older Kunta Kinte in Roots, the role that earned him an Emmy nomination and proved every argument he had ever made. The work kept coming after that, a sharp turn in Coming to America, years on the West Wing, and a one-man stage show he wrote and toured for decades. His home state honored him near the end, placing him in the New Jersey Hall of Fame. A private history ran quietly beneath all of it. Amos married Noel Mickelson in 1965, 2 years before the Supreme Court struck down bans on interracial marriage, and the 2 of them raised a daughter and a son while working as social workers before the cameras ever found him. His final chapter arrived gently and then strangely. Amos died of congestive heart failure at a Los Angeles hospital on August 21, 2024, at the age of 84. The world did not learn of it for more than 5 weeks, his passing kept private, while his grown children stood at odds over his care. He was cremated 9 days after he died, and his ashes went home with his son, leaving no cemetery, no headstone, no fixed place on any map for the people who loved him to visit. James Evans was the father television finally got right. John Amos was the man it punished for insisting they keep getting it right. Second in this story is the young man whose single shouted word became the sound of an entire decade. Jimmie Walker played JJ, the gangly, grinning eldest son whose catchphrase exploded out of that kitchen and into every living room in America. The word itself was not even his idea. A director insisted he shout it in episode after episode until the country could not stop repeating it. The popularity was instant and enormous, and it was also the very thing that split the show apart. Because the louder JJ got, the more his television parents felt the family they cared about slipping into clowning. Walker came up the hard way and the funny way at once. He sold concessions at Yankee Stadium as a kid, trained in radio engineering through a youth program, and started doing stand-up in 1969, working clubs until appearances on national television put him in front of the casting director who changed his life. He stayed a working comedian his whole career, which turned out to matter, because the show that made him a household name did not make him rich the way audiences assume. Here is the part that stings. Walker has said he receives almost nothing in residuals from a sitcom that has run in syndication for half a century, meaning the money he earned came mostly during the original episodes and little since. Estimates of his pay vary, landing in the low thousands of dollars per episode in the early years, and his net worth today sits near $800,000, modest for a man whose face defined a generation of television. He never married and never had children, and by his own telling, no real friendship existed between him and the 2 actors who played his mother and father. Their phone numbers were never even in his pocket, so picture it clearly. The most famous person in that fictional family spent those years essentially alone inside it, loved by millions of strangers and a stranger to the people standing right beside him. Walker turned the fame into a long road instead of a fortune, appearing in films like Airplane, hosting radio, and publishing a memoir about the whole strange ride. He is 78 now, still touring with the stand-up act that has outlasted every paycheck the catchphrase ever brought him. J.J. Evans was the life of a family that gathered every week around a dinner table. Jimmie Walker lived those same years without the family the rest of the country believed he had. The third name held that household together with nothing but her spine and her voice. Esther Rolla played Florida Evans, the mother who could quiet a room with one look and then crack it wide open with grief. And the single most remembered moment of the entire series belongs to her, the scene where Florida shatters a punch bowl and screams after learning her husband is dead. Roll had power before she ever stepped onto that set, and she used it. When producers first pitched her the role, they wanted Florida to be a single mother, and Roll refused unless the character had a husband. She won that fight, and John Amos walked through the door because she insisted on it. She spent her energy guarding what that family meant. Roll said out loud, in print, that the J.J. character was being written as a teenager who could not read, could not work, and did not think, and that something damaging was being slipped to black children through the oldest son. When the producers refused her a raise she felt she had earned as the lead, she walked away after the 4th season. They begged her back for the final year, and she returned only on her own terms, demanding better scripts, a more responsible J.J., and the freedom to undo the marriage the writers had forced on her character. Her road to that stage had been long. Roll was the 10th of 18 children of Bahamian immigrants. She studied at Yale, and she worked in the New York garment district by day while acting at night long before fame found her in her 50s. The honors arrived in time, a Golden Globe nomination during the run of the show, and an Emmy in 1979 for a television film. And she kept working steadily in pictures like Driving Miss Daisy long after Florida Evans left the air. The ending came in November of 1998. Roll died in Culver City, California, from complications of diabetes, 9 days after her 78th birthday, having spent her final stretch on dialysis. Her body was flown home to Pompano Beach, the Florida town she was born in, for a funeral at the church she belonged to. She rests now in Westview Community Cemetery, one of the oldest black burial grounds in South Florida, in the same earth as 2 of her sisters, both of them actresses. The 3 women returned to the soil they came from. Florida Evans was the moral center of a television family. Esther Rolla was a woman who would rather lose the role of her life than watch it lose its meaning. What is the first thing you picture when you hear the name Florida Evans, the shattered punch bowl or the woman who refused to back down? Drop it in the comments and tell me. 4th on this list is the daughter who proved a young black woman on television could be sharp, ambitious, and impossible to reduce. Bernadette Stanis played Thelma, the only Evans daughter, trading rapid-fire insults with J.J. 1 second and carrying real intelligence the next, written as a girl headed for a life that mattered. Stanis earned her place there. She grew up in Brownsville, Brooklyn, won beauty titles as a teenager, and claimed a seat at the Juilliard School, one of the hardest conservatories in the country to enter. Then the show called, and she made a choice. Stanis left Juilliard in her sophomore year to play Thelma, walking away from a classical training most performers would give anything to finish. She never looked back at that decision with regret, and the role made her one of the first black teenage girls to anchor a network series. Her life since has bent towards something harder than fame. Stanis married 4 times, finding lasting ground at last with Kevin Fontana, her husband since 1981, with whom she raised 2 daughters. The chapter that defines her now arrived when her mother developed Alzheimer's disease. She became a caregiver, then an author and an advocate, writing a book about what it costs to watch a parent disappear by inches and turning her own grief into help for other families walking the same road. The book she wrote about those years has become a quiet lifeline for caregivers who recognize their own exhaustion in her pages. She is 72 now, living in Atlanta, still writing, still speaking, still answering letters from people who grew up watching her. The girl who left a conservatory for a sitcom built a second life out of words and care, and she did it long after the cameras stopped rolling. Fans still line up to meet her at reunions, and she greets each one as if the show never ended. Thelma Evans was the bright daughter the writers said would become a surgeon. Bernadette Stanis became something the script never imagined, a woman who spends her days helping strangers survive the slow loss of the people they love. The fifth name wrote a song you have heard 1,000 times without ever knowing it was hers. Janet Dubois played Willona Woods, the divorced neighbor with the bold wardrobe and the faster comebacks, the friend who turned every crisis into a laugh and then quietly carried the most tender storyline the show ever told. Dubois shaped that character herself, building Willona's style and timing into a portrait of a black woman who walked through the door with command. Before any of it, she trained on Broadway, sharing a stage with Sammy Davis Jr. in the 1960s, and Norman Lear hired her after watching her in a play. After the Evans parents were written out, Willona became the soul the show leaned on, the adult who held that apartment together. Here is the talent the credits never showed. Dubois co-wrote and sang the theme song to The Jeffersons, the rising melody about moving on up that became one of the most recognized pieces of television music ever made, a piece of work she owned long after her acting roles faded. She later won 2 Emmy Awards for voice work and a Peabody before that, a career far deeper than one apartment hallway. The end of her story carries a strange ache. Dubois died in her sleep at her daughter's home in Glendale, California, on the 17th of February in 2020, from cardiac arrest, with kidney disease, and other conditions her family had not realized were so advanced. Her age was reported as 74. Records suggested she was closer to 87, and the truth was never settled, so that a woman who spent more than 50 years in front of audiences left behind a public unsure of the most basic fact about her, the year she was born. There is no grave to visit. Dubois was cremated, and her family scattered part of her ashes at sea and kept the rest at home, so the neighbor who sang about rising up was given back to open water, everywhere and nowhere at once. Willona Woods was the friend who made the hard times bearable for everyone around her. Janet Dubois was a woman whose biggest hit was a song for another family's show, and whose own age stayed a riddle to the very end. If these stories are pulling you in, take a second to subscribe before the next one, because the youngest child in that Chicago apartment had already conquered Broadway before most kids finish grade school. And what he did after the show may be the most surprising turn on this entire list. The youngest Evans comes 6th, a Broadway professional before he was old enough to drive. Ralph Carter played Michael, the grade schooler who quoted Black history and argued politics with the adults and somehow made it feel like hope instead of a gimmick. Carter brought that gravity honestly. By the time Good Times found him, he had debuted on Broadway at 9, won a Drama Desk Award, taken a Theatre World honor, and earned a Tony nomination for the musical Raisin, all before he turned 13. Norman Lear wanted him badly. The producer bought out the remainder of Carter's Broadway contract just to cast him, and during the show's run, the boy was groomed for pop stardom, releasing a disco album whose title single climbed into the top 10. For a stretch, Ralph Carter looked like a child star strapped to a rocket. Then, he did the rarest thing a famous person can do. Carter stepped back. When the show ended in 1979, he left television almost entirely, returning to the stage and to music and choosing a private life so complete that the public knows very little about how he has spent the decades since. He surfaced now and then, on a New York stage in 2005 at a cast reunion or two, but he never chased the spotlight that had been his for the taking. When he did appear, it was on his terms, reuniting with his old castmates at award shows and then slipping back out of view. He is 65 now, and the silence around his life reads less as sadness than as decision. The choice of a man who had fame early and concluded it was not the thing he wanted most. The child who outclassed nearly every adult around him simply walked off the path the whole industry expected him to run. Michael Evans was the family genius bound for a courtroom. Ralph Carter walked away from the stardom that was already his, choosing a quiet life over the one the whole industry had planned for him. 7th on this list spent 6 seasons getting laughs as the building superintendent everyone loved to insult. Johnny Brown played Nathan Bookman, the put-upon super who absorbed every jab with a wounded dignity that only made the audience laugh harder. What most viewers never knew was the polished entertainer underneath. Brown had been a professional singer who toured with a famous saxophonist, a protege of Sammy Davis Jr., a Broadway performer directed by Sidney Poitier, and a 3-season regular on Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. That last job cost him dearly. Brown was a leading choice to play Lamont, the son opposite Red Fox on Sanford and Son, one of the great roles of the era, but his contract binding him to Laugh-In meant the part went to another actor. A single clause on a piece of paper took one of the best chances of his life and handed it to someone else. He kept working for decades all the same, turning up on The Jeffersons, Family Matters, and Martin, a familiar face audiences greeted like an old friend. His death came with a cruel kind of suddenness. On the 2nd of March in 2022, Brown went to his doctor's office in Los Angeles for a routine check of his pacemaker, and shortly after he left, his heart stopped and he collapsed. He was rushed to a nearby hospital, where he died at the age of 84. His daughter, the Broadway actress Sharon Catherine Brown, said the appointment had been ordinary, which made losing him that day feel like a thing snatched out of the family's hands. What remains of him is mostly the laughter and the music because there is no marker to stand before. Brown was cremated, and his final resting place was never made public, leaving a man who sang and clowned for half a century without a single fixed spot on any map. Nathan Bookman was the hapless super the whole building looked down on. Johnny Brown was a singer, a stage talent, and a Sammy Davis protege who lost the role of a lifetime to the fine print of a contract he could not escape. The last name is one you already know, though you may not know it started right here. Janet Jackson joined Good Times in its 5th season as Penny, the neighbor child who first trailed JJ with a crush and then became the vehicle for the most serious story the show ever attempted. Penny was a girl being abused by her mother, beaten and burned with a hot iron, until the family discovered the truth and Willona stepped in to adopt her. Jackson was 10 years old when she carried that material, and she carried it with a depth that startled everyone who watched. Music was in her blood from the start. The youngest of the Jackson family, she grew up surrounded by performance, and Good Times was simply her first real job before the world learned her name for entirely different reasons. By the time she was a teenager, she was already stepping toward a recording career that would dwarf everything that came before. What happened next is the kind of turn the other 7 stories never got. That small, frightened girl from the Chicago apartment grew into one of the best-selling recording artists in the history of popular music, a global headliner whose name needs no show attached to it. Her records have sold in the tens of millions, her tours fill stadiums, and the awards have piled up across decades. The child the Evans family took in off the street became a star far larger than the series that introduced her. She is 60 now, still recording, still filling arenas, decades removed from the hallway where audiences first met a quiet girl hiding bruises. Of all 8 people who passed through that apartment, hers is the story that bent farthest upward, the youngest face on the call sheet, and the biggest name to walk away from it. Penny Gordon was the broken child the neighborhood chose to save. Janet Jackson took that small, frightened role and walked it straight out of a Chicago housing project into a fame the whole world would come to know by a single name. They are scattered now across a Florida cemetery, the open sea, 2 California homes, and 1 resting place no one will name. The other 4 are still here,